Hey, welcome to the show, Gary.
Hi, Logan.
Hey, for those who don't know who you are, maybe you can explain what it is that you do for Broadcom slash VMware, and maybe you can also include a highlight of your career because you've been at the company for a while now. So I'm interested to hear about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I've been here 15 years this year, almost as long as you, right? I guess in terms of my role, it really falls into a couple of areas. Primarily, our team is focused on the architecture for VCF. So a key deliverable is the design guide. So in the product documentation, alongside, the usual procedures and those kind of things, we have an architectural design where we lay out all of the options within the VCF platform. Obviously, we'll talk about more about that later. Um, and the second part of our role is really, I guess it's evangelism, but not evangelism in the same way that you do it. It's more of, we get called into customer engagements, customer accounts, problem accounts, maybe as someone's hit an issue, try to help resolving those problems. And as we move forward under the Broadcom world, we're now being involved more with partners. So actually helping partners understand, because there's a lot of change that's gone on within the organization, as you well know. We're close to engineering. We're close to the product management teams, so we have good insight into the futures. Um, yeah, we focus a lot on those core things. And I guess from a career highlight, for me, the biggest aspect or biggest part of my career has probably been involved in the VMware validated designs. I think most people, I ask in sessions, anyone heard of the VVDs? And 9 times out of 10, at least 50% of the audience puts their hands up. So it's something that we produced as an organization, 10 years ago now, which really struck a chord with our customers. We had a bunch of products that were very, integrated but not integrated well, as you know. And what's interesting for me is seeing that evolution of where we are now as an organization, where we had sort of these 10, 15 things that we're now really trying to push with VMware Cloud Foundation as a single platform. Yeah, and I guess the big part of that was helping professional services teams in terms of building the service offering around VVD back in the day. So I kind of pioneered the service offering before them being pulled into what was the validated design team.
Yeah, I think the VVDs were, well, very important for customers, not just for customers, but also for folks internally, because I think a lot of people were challenged with the adoption of all of the different components and creating a single cloud out of it. So I
Yeah,
think it's huge.
yeah, exactly. I mean, if we kind of go back 10 years, we had so many moving parts, so many different things, so many different ways of doing stuff that, we really needed to have some kind of blueprint glue that could like brought it together. And I think you're absolutely right. I think there were a lot of teams internally within the organization started to realize how complex what we had as a portfolio really was becoming. So yeah, it was a staple for a long time until VCF came along.
Yeah, and I think that's still the case, to be honest. If you look at VCF, it's still relatively complex. There are many different constructs involved, and that's actually going to be the topic of today because I was talking to a bunch of people at the VMUG, and they all mentioned that your session was probably one of their favorite sessions at the VMUG Connect event, which was fantastic to hear. And when I started looking at the content, and of course I had seen some of the content already floating around, and I've seen some of your sessions in the past, I figured it would be good to get you on the show to actually talk through some of that content. Because even for myself, and I've been involved in VMware technology for the longest time, sometimes it's still rather complex, especially when it comes to VCF. But before we dive into those specific constructs itself, it's also probably good to explain from the highest level what we really talk about when we talk about the VCF private cloud, because even to me that's not always exactly clear what is it that actually means to you, but also what should it mean for a customer.
Yeah, and I think I've personally struggled with the concept of a private, VCF private cloud. We call it out as part of the taxonomy for VCF. And for me, it's not really a construct, it's more of a concept. So, as Broadcom's very focused now on private cloud. So, we're not really in the hyperscaler market. Now, private cloud simply to me means it's private to that organization. So it's not shared with another organization. So, a private cloud could be on-prem, it could be, co-located, it could be a managed service, but the key thing is it's that dedicated. Or it could be just, all of your standalone vSphere instances. But the key thing is it's trying to drive more of an operational model from a private cloud agile perspective. And that's kind of how I see it from where we're trying to drive VCF as a platform.
Yeah, I think the operational model is a important aspect. Now, of course, besides the operational model, when we talk about VCF, there are also many different constructs that come into play.
Yeah.
And I struggled with that a lot, especially when those new constructs started popping up. Something like a fleet, for instance, wasn't something that existed back in the days when I was still doing implementations.
Yep.
You had a cluster, uh, you had a vCenter server, and there were multiple clusters, etc. But a fleet, it did not exist. So maybe we could start at the top and then work our way down. So some of the listeners who are not that familiar with the VCF constructs or with VCF in general can understand as well what that actually means and what that relates to or how they should look at it. So maybe we can start at that. What is a fleet?
Yeah, exactly. And I'll be honest, I struggled with the concept of a fleet as well. I'd heard the term in the industry, and honestly, I'd heard it more from a hyperscaler perspective. But in essence, what we're trying to say is from the fleet concept is all about sort of a single set of management components to help you orchestrate, operate many pools of infrastructure from a single location. So think of a simple concept, and we kind of had this in VCF before 9.0, things like certificate management, like being able to configure integration into your Microsoft CA in one location, and then very easily from a single UI be able to, update and cycle through certificate updates across your whole infrastructure. So rather than managing things and on an individual vCenter level, which is kind of what we've always done, right? It's, okay, you had an enhanced link mode, but it was very, you do something in one vCenter, you go and do it again in another vCenter and so on and so forth. So it's more about having this single management control plane where you have all your infrastructure easily managed, you can define policies centrally, and then you can apply those policies down onto the underlying components. So that's the sort of like the top level in terms of how we're kind of pushing VCF as a platform in that you create a fleet, and within the fleet, you then have all of your cascading components for your software-defined data center underneath.
Yeah, and some of those cascading components, of course, are you already alluded to it in an earlier answer, the
Yeah.
instance, and then
Yep.
we've got a domain as well. So
Yep.
how does that relate to the fleet and how does that relate to each other? Because that also got me confused fairly fast. I mean, I love clusters, and that's usually where it ends. And then, of course,
Yep.
all of a sudden, we've got a fleet, we've got an instance, we've got a domain. Explain it to me.
Yeah. So first of all, the term VCF instance. So that's obviously a well-known term in terms of VCF. So in 3, 2, 3, 4, and 5, we refer to a VCF instance. Um, and the way that I describe a VCF instance is think of it as like a control or management boundary. So the concept of a VCF instance effectively in the old world is an SDDC manager. So, I think anyone that's familiar with VCF in the past will know SDDC manager was kind of that fleet manager, but only for the things it controlled. So essentially, the way that you should think about it is that we're moving the sort of the fleet management capabilities like lifecycle management, which is probably the biggest one. But again, referring back to that cert management and password management capabilities that we had at the SDC manager level, we're moving that up into the fleet. So you then can have multiple VCF instances and be able to control those policies. But an instance really is where you get down into the stuff that you and I know very well, AV center, where you then have your compute, your resources, network storage, etc., from a software-defined data center. And when it comes to a VCF instance, we have this concept of VCF domains. So again, it's a slightly different change in language, but we're starting to refer to, a VCF instance has multiple VCF domains. And then within the domains, you have the next layer of the platform.
Yeah, that part, I started to get used to it, as you mentioned, because it was already a part of the VCF stack for a while.
Yeah.
Now, what kind of confused me then is when I started looking at some of the diagrams, is that if you look at some of the other products that are involved, things like
Yeah.
VCF automation, VCF ops, where that boundary is for those products. So can they actually span domains? Can they span instances? How does that actually work? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I guess this is where you start to bring it together. Now we understand what, a domain is, VCF domain, what a fleet is. Um, we then look at the component pieces. So to your point, VCF automation and VCF operations, those are referred to as what we define as the fleet level components. So from a construct perspective, those components sit as a fleet level. And then all of the VCF instances, which contain your SDC manager, your vCenters, your NSX manager components, can all be managed from those single fleet level. So as you start to scale out, you would add more VCF instances and they'll be managed from those individual VCF operations and automation components. Um, so right now in VCF 9, for every fleet, you only have one automation instance and one operations instance. And I know that has become, a bit of a challenge for some organizations, because if you think about certainly financial services is an interesting space because a lot of financial services have multiple platforms. And you'll be familiar with this in terms of, they have their dev platform, but then they have their prod and their pre-prod. Now, in the old world, that was very easy because you could easily segregate them and you just say, well, I have a vCenter manage my dev, a vCenter for my prod, and a vCenter for my pre-prod. Um, but now it's starting to get customers to think slightly differently that you've got to up level the management layer. So you can still have that separation. Now, some organizations will require physical separation of those platforms. So that might be a compliance requirement. But by and large, prod and pre-prod, there doesn't need to be physical separation in terms of never the twain shall meet, but you can at least manage them from a specific, from a fleet level point of view. So think about those VCF instances. I can have a VCF instance which is purely prod and a VCF instance that is pre-prod. And so what we'll see is as the platform evolves, we'll start to be able to provide additional service capabilities, but tied to a VCF instance level. So you kind of start to think about an instance as being sort of a management boundary or one way of controlling a set of software-defined data center resources.
Yeah, there are actually two things that I think are interesting to talk about next. Then is this, of course, there's a lot of maximum configurations that we need to take into account. The other thing that you also
Yeah.
mentioned is the physical separation, so we'll get into that as well. But let's start with the maximums that we need to take into consideration and some of the limitations that there are from a product perspective, because we've got the fleet level, then of course we have the instance, we've got the domains. There are only so many numbers of vCenter servers and clusters and hosts, etc., that you can have. And even virtual machines have a limits on a per cluster basis, on a per vCenter server basis. So what are some of those things customers need to think about? Well, I mean, I'm assuming the smaller customers, they're probably not, overly concerned about those
Yeah.
things if you don't have 100,000 VMs. But what if I have 100,000 VMs? What does that actually look like? And how do I go about constructing those things?
Yeah, and I think this is probably the biggest challenge that our customers are finding actually is, the concept of I want to control everything from a single fleet. I think everyone loves. They're like, this is brilliant. I can define a policy once or multiple policies and just push them down to my infrastructure. In terms of the scales and limitations, what we've found with the conversations with customers so far is they really fall into three key areas. First of all, you already mentioned scale. Um, Scale is an interesting topic, and it's a really confusing topic in my view. Um, you know, we are evolving the platform, with each new update and each new release. And the biggest challenge I think that we've found is I think we underestimated the sort of the conversation around the scale numbers. Because if you look up where we were, 7 or 8 individual products coming together as a single product, each one of those components had different scale limitations. And as a customer, or even as an architect, coming in at the platform and going, well, I've got 50,000 VMs. What does that look like from an architecture is a real challenge. Um, so especially when different products use different values for their scale, like, one system might be it's all about VMs, another system might be it's about objects that you create in the platform. But I think the biggest scale concern is really sort of if you think what we've done, we've made operations the center of the universe for a fleet, right? So really the key aspect there is around the scale limitations of operations. And actually, operations is pretty good from a scale perspective, but it's working out those numbers as to how big you need the appliances to be from the outset, because it's all around metrics being collected, all these objects and stuff. We continue to add and improve on those numbers, which I think is starting to remove the conversation purely from a scale point of view, because customers do have big infrastructure, but I think the second limitation actually counterbalances the first on scale, and that's network connectivity. So we've had many customers come to us and say, "I'm a global organization. I want a single fleet to manage the world." And then, you start talking latency bandwidths, and that's where the next challenge comes. Um, and we've done a lot in the product recently to improve that. So, as you know, from a storage, you've got vSAN stretch cluster latency limitations. Then you've got vCenter, vMotion, DRS latency limitations, and then you start to layer in operations as well on top. Um, I think when we first released VCF 9, we were stating 150 milliseconds was the limitation for a fleet. Well, you can imagine how that went down, right? Literally every customer was going, "Yep, won't be doing a fleet then," because that's just not going to work in my organization. So we've actually been working quite heavily in those areas. I know members of engineering, the PM team, have been focused on that recently. We recently published a new ports and protocols diagram. The key thing being 300 milliseconds, which was the target, as being sort of like the sort of limiting factor when it talks about fleet managing a VCF instance and such like. And I think, and this was a question I asked at the VMware Connect in Amsterdam that we were at together. How many people can actually withstand 300 milliseconds? And surprisingly, most people in the room put their hands up. Now, I'm assuming that's because they're not large, necessarily global enterprises, because you've always got the odd few here and there that will want to be managing sort of Asia Pacific plus Americas and Europe at the same time. And then the third dynamic is really around organizational placement. Um, Organizational structure may in itself mean that you need to consider whether a single fleet makes sense if you've got operationally different teams managing different regions. And so that in itself could mean that actually one single fleet isn't really a possibility, and that you start to already need to sort of consider maybe multiple fleets as at least an entry point. But at least you're with the fleet concept, you can, I think, scale the boundary of what you're managing operation organizationally, so that you can start to get those operational efficiencies of cloud-like infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, if I look at most of the customers I talk to on a daily basis, I think for the majority of them, a single fleet would work,
Yeah.
unless we're actually specifically talking about a solution where, for instance, disaster recovery or ransomware recovery comes into play. And the funny thing is that I hadn't actually given this much thought, but when I started talking about, for instance, ransomware recovery, the first question one of the VCF customers I asked is, okay, what do I do from a fleet management perspective? Because we're also talking about authentication domain. So what is your opinion on that when we talk about those types of constructs, DR and ransomware recovery?
So yeah, so I think the challenge is that even with any ransomware platform, you've got some kind of connectivity. So it's more about controlling the flow and the access controls. And I don't know if people listen to this were actually aware, but we did release in 9.0 timeframe, we actually had a VMware validated solution. So I didn't mention this at the top of the session, but I was also tech lead for VMware validated solutions for about 3 years. So that was kind of like the evolution of VVD as VCF was taking off and how we laid down additional capabilities on top of the platform. And we worked very closely with the PM and engineering teams to build the first ransomware, on-prem ransomware recovery. Um, and in terms of that architecture, the concept is it's a single fleet. It's just that you've got an isolated workload domain in the recovery instance. And then, of course, you need to lay down the various components to make sure you've got the security. So ensuring that you've got, vDefend firewalls so that replication can be sent in. You have immutable snapshot storage clusters that can be used for storing your VM replication, that kind of stuff. So I don't feel like customers need to go, oh, I need another fleet just to be able to do ransomware recovery. I think we have a story. And as you know, we've been working on improving that story coming in 9.1 with better integration, more automated workflows. A lot of the stuff we did in the 9.0 release was very sort of relying on the technology that was available, but some of the orchestrated workflows weren't there. So I think that the ransomware story for me is that, we can deliver it and we can deliver it within a fleet. So we shouldn't have to go and build another set of infrastructure from a fleet management point of view. But obviously we need to make sure that, we've got that clear isolated workload domain for the recovery instance, integrated endpoint detection and response solutions that help do it. And then vDefend, vDefend firewall not only helps us secure the communication between the instances, but also during the recovery process.
Yeah, and I guess if you do want to do an additional fleet, just from a separation perspective, you can still do that, right? So it's not you have the
Absolutely,
option
yeah.
here.
Yeah, there's nothing stopping you from doing it. I think, we just don't feel that you have to do it because, from an authentication point of view, and we haven't talked about this at all, but one of the new features that we have in 9 is the identity broker with what we refer to as VCF single sign-on. And VCF single sign-on can be done at different levels. So you can have instance specific or you can have fleet wide. So from an authentication point of view, there's nothing stopping you not enabling the VCF single sign-on features within that instance that's your recovery site, and that you fall back to local account management, or even you create your own dedicated localized instance of the identity broker to be able to manage that as a separate authentication domain. So I think there's enough stuff in the product from a capability point of view that we can deal with a lot of the security concerns. It's still early days, I would say, in terms of the on-prem cyber recovery aspect. But knowing how popular the cloud version was, the fact that we're now bringing it on-prem, I wonder how much of sort of being part of a single fleet is a concern for organizations, because they've already removed it from the if they were doing it to the cloud, that involves them going out to the internet. So already they're kind of bringing back on-prem to help with the security layer.
Yeah, I think it's going to be one of those solutions that will literally create an explosion within the company in terms of people looking for knowledge everywhere to understand what it
Yeah,
is that we're trying to solve here. Because even with the conversations that I'm having with customers, sometimes you find yourself, Googling acronyms as you go through the conversation itself, because there's so many new terms popping
yeah,
up everywhere. It's almost impossible. Now, the other thing also which I found interesting is when we talk about availability, recoverability, etc. From a VCF perspective. Of course, I know we support stretch clusters. It's one of those things which a lot of customers, especially in Europe, were asking for. But there's also replication at the storage level, replication at the VM level. We also do some things at the application level, and that also can or may apply to the management stack. So what is it that you typically see customers implementing? Because I think that's also a big part of what your team does, right? Being involved with the implementation. So I would be interested in understanding what it is that customers do.
Yeah, and it's an evolving story when it comes to the management stack. So, I'd like to say that we have a fully fledged out, recoverability and availability story to VCF. The fact of the matter is, 9.0 was the first release. As you know, a lot of the focus was on the single UIs, single operational stack. We still have some work to do from a recoverability point of view. But if I kind of go back to the VVD days, we had pretty good story there. Recoverability from a management stack point of view was, you have application level HA. So pretty much most components have, an HA story. So if you think about things like log management, you think about automation and VCF operations, you have choices there. Um, vCenter has always been the interesting one from an application high availability. We have vCenter HA. I think I probably, I don't know how I would put this, but our team's always been a little bit sort of hesitant to include vCenter HA into our architecture designs. We've always felt that the sort of the pain of configuring, maintaining, and operating was far greater than the benefit you received compared to vSphere HA, right? Just to be brutally blunt on the topic. Um, so, vCenter has always been a bit of a single point of failure, except for, well, vSphere HA recovers, and, how much do you need it from a day-to-day running of the business application? It's just, when it comes to management, there's an issue. Now, obviously, the way that we're building VCF 9 now is continuing to evolve. We introduced more of a containerized platform, and we have some limitations, like things like live recovery, being able to protect a container, right? It's not there. It's something that we're looking at, and hopefully that will come. So I think we still have sort of HA from a management component for most aspects of the stack. Um, Backup and restore, obviously, everyone needs to be backing up and restore. We have some areas like automation is a bit more of a backup and restore for DR today. That hopefully will evolve over time. And of course, some pieces we can still replicate using storage replication. So, we've been a big user of vSphere replication in the past. We now have vSAN replication built in. So I think the options and the availability is constantly improving. In terms of what we've seen in the past, we've certainly seen stretch clusters in Europe is a big thing. It's always interesting when you talk about vSphere stretch cluster. Is that availability or is that disaster recovery? Not going to get into that debate here, but I've heard customers say things that I totally disagree with. Snapshots. Oh, it's a backup. Is it though? Those kind of conversations that we've probably had many times, and I see you smiling. You probably had those conversations as well. Um, so, you know, I think stretched is definitely a hot topic in Europe. US becomes a bit more of a challenge. So replication, being able to replicate within the hypervisor obviously is a massive win. Massive capability there to be able to protect stuff. So it's definitely sort of we've got a lot of customers using storage replication still as well, right? So having orchestrated recovery with live recovery as well. I think we'll start to see a lot more in that space, which is actually quite exciting for me because I started out as a consultant at professional services, as you know, in the team that you used to be in. And a big part of my day job was site recovery manager projects. I did an awful lot of disaster recovery engagements. And yeah, obviously it was all storage replication back then. So I think sort of, having the flexibility and choice is definitely making the optionality a lot better for our customers.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because I did the very first implementation of Site Recovery Manager worldwide. And at this point in time, I haven't done much with Site Recovery Manager since then, probably not in the last 15 years or so, but it's all coming back again now with live recovery and especially with the ransomware. effort that we have ongoing and the conversations that we're having with the customers, it seems to be more important than ever before.
Yeah.
Now, you've mentioned that you've seen some of the customers implementing that for the management stack. I'm assuming that also applies to their workload domains then, right? Are they implementing similar
Yeah.
technologies or what are they doing?
Yeah, I think it's a mixture there. So obviously, there's massive shift to what we refer to as modern applications, right? And I think certainly where customers can, they're sort of reviewing their applications, how the applications are built, shifting a little bit away from infrastructure being the thing that does availability to actually, well, let's build it into the application natively, because then actually we don't really care about the infrastructure, it just becomes pools of resource. Um, so, we see a lot of that. Um, but where that's not possible, I think, go back to live recovery, vCenter application, those tools work just as well to be able to do the recovery. I guess the biggest challenge with a lot of these organizations, a lot of customers is fully understanding the impact of an application. We talk about 15 years ago, I don't think the world has changed that much because organizations, personnel change, people that had knowledge move on. So I think the biggest challenge with application recovery is, well, what happens when this component fails and what does it talk to and what do I need to fail with it has always been the biggest issue. And that was always the biggest part of most of my consultancy engagements, was helping them understand and doing the discovery of what they need to protect as a group of services to actually fail over an application. Because, it's very easy to go, well, that's my application server. But if it talks to three other things and they're critical, and you don't know about it, then you don't really have a disaster recovery plan.
Yeah, and I guess the same applies to that from a VCF constructs perspective, right? If you don't
Yeah,
know what is talking to what, how do you know which virtual machines or services should be part of the same domain, instance slash fleet? I guess the
yeah,
same applies there as well.
yeah, and also understanding, not just the communication, but actually which bits are critical. And we had this debate internally where product management was going, well, we need to recover components A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Then, we look at it from our experience of going, why am I going to recover a vCenter that is only managing infrastructure in that data center, in the primary data center? If the primary data center has failed and the only thing it manages is in that data center, why do I care about recovering it? So, we've had those conversations. I think it goes back to understanding on, like you say, what's talking to where, what is critical versus what's non-critical. Otherwise, you can start to be protecting 10 times more than you really need to protect. And if there's certain things you want to protect like that, I think you've got bigger problems in your environment than just trying to recover something so low down in the stack.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. I've had those conversations many times in the past where I'm asking the customer the question, okay, what is it that it actually does? And why is it important? I can understand even why you would want to replicate it because the cost of replication may be, fairly low, but do we
Yeah,
actually need to fail over that particular component at this point in time? Because there's going to be a cost associated with failing it over. It needs to be
yeah.
powered on. It's going to claim resources which can't be claimed by other components. So do we really need it or not? So I think that is very valid. Now, if you look at VCF itself, it's fairly prescriptive, and I know there's a lot of different decisions still to be made. I mean, we've spoken about a bunch of these, right? So some of
Yeah.
the limitations that we have, and some of the constructs that we have. Now, when it comes to all of these design decisions and best practices, where should customers actually go to, or people listening to this episode, if they want to find out more about it? Because I know your team has written a lot, and I know there's many sessions online, and I'll make sure to add all of the links to the show notes. So if you have any examples that you can share, that would be fantastic, so people can start Googling straight away.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess as I mentioned at the beginning, a core part of what we do is we build this thing called the VCF Design Guide. So that's the thing that I think customers should go look at first and foremost. Um, you know, you talk about VCF being prescriptive. I think it's become more optionality, so it's less prescriptive ultimately. Back in the sort of the 2 and 3 days, it literally, you clicked go, it did its automation, and the thing was built. One of the things that has sort of been emphasized with 9.0 is that in order to get customers to move with us on the journey to the VCF private cloud, we need to meet customers where they are. So um, just take vSphere, for example. There are so many configurations and widgets and dials you can do inside vSphere alone. So, we've had to sort of expand what we support as a sort of deployment mechanism. And so really, if we talk about mentioning validated designs again, that was a very prescriptive design. We basically told you exactly which components to deploy. We told you exactly how to deploy each component. In VCF 9, you now have choices. At the simplest level, if you look at VCF operations, which is, as we mentioned, is like the central management for the fleet, you can deploy that in three modes. You can have a single VCF operations instance, or you can have one that uses multiple nodes to create an HA in a single site, or you can deploy it in a continuous availability mode where you actually deploy it in two separate locations. So optionality has become a big thing. So we've had to really kind of rethink our design guide. So we still believe design decisions are key because that's helped set how each of these things are deployed. Um, in the design guide now, we talk about requirements versus recommendations. So again, in the VVD world, it was everything was a requirement. This is how you build it. If you want to be successful, if you want to de-risk your environment and you want the greatest return on investment in a fast pace, you do what we say. Whereas now, what we've had to do is to take design decisions and really split them into these are the things that VCF is going to give you as a requirement. And these are the things that we would recommend you do on top as a best practice. Doesn't mean you have to, but we're at least giving you a bit more of a prescriptive way of doing it. So in that design guide, really, it's kind of split into three sections. First of all, we have what we call the architectural options. So this is where I talk about the optionality. So giving you sort of the 10,000 feet view of, okay, each component that I'm deploying can be deployed in, one, two, three, or four ways. What are the benefits and attributes of each? And that allows you to kind of pick the right uh, model for your requirements, right, for your needs. Um, that then flips into the bottom of the document, which talks about the design, detailed design, essentially. So very similar to the way we used to do VVD, a bit more detail around what your design options are, detail around the design decisions. But what we also introduced in that design guide this time around was something called blueprints. So this again is a little bit back to our roots of a validated design because if you've now got optionality, you're now elongating the architecture design process. So what we wanted to do was to say, from our experience in the last 10, 15 years working with a lot of customers, we know that there are typical deployment models that customers follow. Single site versus multi-site versus multi-availability zones across those. So typically four core topologies that most organizations fall into. Then of course there's the sort of the minimal footprint. How do I get this thing up and running like a lab? So what we decided to do was to build out these blueprints. So we have 5 blueprints within the design guide, and each blueprint has a design profile where we define from a business point of view kind of what we're trying to achieve from that blueprint. And then each blueprint simply selects the model of the component that aligns to the design profile. And all intents and purposes, all we're trying to do is to say, hey, you're probably going to align to one of these. You may not be 100% aligned. In fact, I would argue probably no customer is ever 100% aligned. But here is a blueprint which at least gives you the sort of the starter for 10 in terms of your high level design. And then, of course, you would do your typical architecture design workshops where you'd look at each component, understand whether there's any adjustments you need. The example I use is like distributed switches, right? A simple thing like I think each of our blueprints we use the single distributed switch model, right? It's the simplest, it's 2 NICs, happy days. But let's say you've got an organizational procurement process that dictates 4 NICs in every single server, right? Maybe that's your standard, and that's fine. So you can immediately go to the distributed switch section and go, well, actually, we have 4 NICs. That's what we always buy. That's our standard. So you can go and swap the model out and pick the model that uses the 4 NICs. Now that could be storage separation because you're using vSAN, or it could be workload network separation, depending on what the requirements are. So, that's kind of what we've tried to do with the design guide, and that's really where I would tell customers, go look at this, look at the architectural options, understand your choices, then look at the blueprint and see which blueprint best matches what you're trying to deliver, and then take that. And we do this internally, right? With our customer engagements, we take a blueprint, or we understand the customer, understand the sites, the WAN link limitations, some of the scale requirements, and try to pin a blueprint as the discussion point, and then from there start to dig down into the detail.
Now, you've mentioned it a few times and you
Go
said
on.
customer engagements.
Yeah.
So, if I was a customer, how do I get Gary or someone else from your team like Pori or Reardon on site? How does that actually work? I need to ask for those listening.
Yeah, so for our team, it's obviously an internal Broadcom where we have certain accounts that are, strategic, or maybe there's, opportunities on the table. So we get involved very heavily with those types of customers. We have a top customer program, as you know. In fact, every one of those top customers has one of my team aligned with it. But I guess, ultimately, there's a big shift towards partners. Partners are really the folks now that are going to be doing, the deployments, a lot of the architecture designs. We're going to start working very closely with partners, sharing our knowledge with them to upskill those people. So I guess to get access to me, you've got to be lucky, right? You got to be one of the right customers on the list. But most of our team blog, we share information, we do VMUG sessions, those kind of things. So there's always opportunity to come, and talk to us if we're at one of those events. The Explore on tours. I'm sure we'll be on those shows, those road shows this year. So yeah.
Yeah, and it makes sense as well to enable the partners because there's only one Gary, there's only one Pori. There are only so many customers you can meet with, so that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the biggest problem. It's scale. We really need to make sure that we're helping the trusted advisors out there that we have access to, that we can help them to then help customers. So
Yeah, and just so people understand, I've mentioned two names so far, but of course the team is much larger than that. So it's not just Pori and Gary who are part of the team. I'm just mentioning those names because every once in a while, when I get a customer question, those are the two names that pop up in my head as well. And unfortunately for Pori, I've involved him in many very difficult conversations. Whenever he sees a message from me popping up, he's like, "Oh my God, there we go again. It's another 16 weeks gone." Hey, thanks, Gary. That was fantastic. Now, before I let you go, any famous last words or any final thoughts you would just like to share with the audience?
I guess we've talked about a lot today, right? We've talked about sort of very high level concepts. What I would say to customers listening to this is go look at the material, go understand the architecture. I think there's probably a lot of vSphere only customers, maybe vSphere with ops, that are going to be looking to move to VCF in the future. Use the resources out there, use the design guide. Obviously, if you find me on LinkedIn, reach out, happy to kind of engage. Work with your trusted advisors, so your partners, maybe you work directly with Broadcom, your account teams, ask the right questions, and obviously use the community. The VMware community is, invaluable when it comes to sharing information. There's a lot of great blogs out there. As I mentioned, I do blog when I find time. Most of my team have blogs. Just sort of, chat amongst yourselves. It's amazing what you can learn from each other. I think the VMware community certainly instills that confidence and sharing between learnings.
And that's it. Thanks for tuning in to the Unexplored Territory podcast. If you enjoyed this episode,
Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review or rating wherever possible. And please join us again next time as we uncover more insights into cutting-edge solutions shaping the world of IT. Until then, staying comfortable, keep exploring.